Democratic presidential candidate and frontrunner Joe Biden has just revealed his climate action plan, which he calls a plan for a clean energy revolution and environmental justice. And so, in a presentation video accompanying this release, he said, "Science tells us that how we act or fail to act in the next 12 years will determine the very livability of our planet." And he has a lot of rhetoric in this plan, targeting the 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming and referencing the Green New Deal as an important framework and so on. And so he's really making up for his recent, in the eyes of the Greens, his recent failures to address the issue with his big plan and his rhetoric. And I just want to quote something to start it up from this plan. And Biden said, "If the global temperature continues to increase at the current rate and surpasses 1.5 degrees C, the existential threat to life will not be limited to just ecological systems, but will extend to human life as well." So he also makes reference to the 2030 deadline, the next 12 years, of course, and so on. And my assumption is that this language polls very well with the key constituencies for him to win the Democratic primaries. But I also want to talk about some content of the plan. So there are a lot of detailed items that I can't all summarize, but I want to pick some of the more important ones as I see them. So the overall plan is to reach net zero carbon emissions in the United States no later than 2050. That's what we've seen from other candidates. Some were a little more aggressive. I think Inslee was a little more aggressive by 2045. But around that thing, that's in almost every green climate plan on the Democratic side right now. And of course, it's also a huge central planning approach, as were the other plans, talking about investments in green energy, electric vehicles, new technologies and breakthroughs that will facilitate this net zero emissions by 2050, utility scale grid storage, and so on. So a lot of keywords and buzzwords in there. Notably, he also mentions, at least in a smaller role, nuclear technology and carbon capture. So that's sometimes missing in other candidates' plan, and that's noteworthy. Also noteworthy is that Biden wants to push other countries into achieving demonstrable climate goals. And I like that point a lot because it's acknowledging that the US is only responsible for about 15% of the global CO2 emissions annually. And that means whatever the United States does domestically, if the rest of the world doesn't do something similar, there's no chance that this strategy will do anything about global warming at all, even if you believe the IPCC modeling and the predictions about global warming in the future. Even if you agree with all of that, if the US acts alone, there's nothing this will change in terms of global climate, of course. And this is not acknowledged by a lot of the other candidates. And there are a lot of items on the international part of this, where he suggests border tariffs to punish countries that don't comply with climate goals and so on. And we've discussed this in part in previous episodes of Power Hour, and these things are like very bureaucratic and complicated. So, if you're buying a, let's say, a piece of electronic from Southeast Asia, how do you know how much CO2 emissions are in this commodity, right? So you would need a giant bureaucracy that tracks all of the sort of material flows and so on to produce this item to actually correctly punish those who still emit a lot of CO2 in manufacturing things. Another big thing, and I think that will be interesting for our audience specifically, is that it's very confrontational towards the fossil fuel industries. So the Biden plan asked for aggressive methane emission limits for the oil and gas operations. This has been recently in use a lot. Methane emissions I think it's less relevant. The rate of emissions for every barrel of oil or cubic feet of natural gas has been declining in America. And I think last week we talked about a new assessment that the leak rate of methane in natural gas and oil production isn't actually as high as previous estimate had been. So the plan will also force public companies to report on climate risks. This has been like a shareholder activism item for many years now. So the Biden plan would make that government policy actually. It wants to conserve 30% of American lands and waters, which has implications for oil and gas leases and other leases, potentially even coal mines. Um, and he will not accept contributions from oil and gas or coal companies or their executives. I think
Well, I
that's
mean, he'll accept contributions from their product. I mean, unless he's having a 100% renewable campaign where, you know, they'll only have power whenever the wind is blowing and they're only, you know, like presumably they're using a lot of oil and gas to sell himself. So, I mean, that like there's definitely the it's quite disingenuous to say that we're not taking support from the industry when your whole existence, particularly for somebody as old as Biden, is dependent on the industry.
yeah, and considering that Biden is sort of the last standing Democratic blue collar presidential candidate, you know, a lot of his potential voters work in the manufacturing industries, which of course depend on, you know, natural gas as a raw material and coal
Well,
and so on.
that's what makes me curious about this move, because if the conventional wisdom was right and it was like that mainstream Democrats agreed with, you know, the most radical AOCs and Bernie's, then Biden should have never had this major lead that he does. And part of why people are, I think, attracted to him in part is just this idea of like, this is the guy who can win because he can appeal to these key states that Trump won, like my home state of Pennsylvania. But if you actually look, there have been stories about this, but I just saw one today. I'm trying to remember where it is, but where I saw it. But labor is very concerned with things like the Green New Deal because they
Mhm.
recognize that that it would be severely harmful to them if something like the Green New Deal or Biden's Green New Deal light passes. Now, I definitely do not pretend to be an expert at this kind of like, you know, which pressure group should you try to appeal to in order to win the Democratic uh, nomination. But to me, like this seems, I would have been very impressed if Biden said something, you know, that was more realistic on climate and had taken a position that was not going to be as insanely detrimental to human beings, just on the grounds of like, look, I'm trying to appeal to Americans at large, not to a handful of elites in, you know, San Francisco and DC.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Democratic polling either, but I think there's a real risk for Biden to not get the nomination. So there are two battles for him. One is, you know, winning the Democratic nomination, which, you know, arguably requires some radicalism on this issue, and then, you know, winning the general election. And, you know, one out for him is that part of his plan actually depends on Congress. And then he can say, okay, well, I have this bold idea, but Congress won't comply. You know, so there's a lot of complexity in this kind of election signaling, I think. And I don't know what the key states look like in terms of voter polling exactly. But so there are a lot of these items that I just mentioned, you know, that are just like directly anti-fossil fuels. And you know, he asked for, you know, a goal of 100% electric vehicles for light and medium vehicles over time, and so on. And it looks much more radical than anything that, you know, was in the Obama agenda. So Joe Biden builds a lot of you know, his experience as a vice president under Obama, and, you know, look at our legacy. We were pushing for Paris and accomplishing that and so on. And now Trump comes in and, unravels all of this, but I will bring us back on track and do this. And then, of course, the standard argument is, oh, this will not, don't look at this as cost. It's just an investment and it will actually save money and create new jobs and so on. So we will have this new green powerhouse and export our superior technology and so on. So these are all the talking points that are, in every Green New Deal type of plan. And yeah, it's quite radical. I'm not sure what the strategy is, but I think Joe Biden is afraid that he might lose the primary election if he's not radical enough on this. It's at least my take on this.
I mean, one lesson here, I think, though, is that we've talked about how many Republicans are saying, like, we have to have a real position on climate, which I agree with. They do need to have a real coherent position on climate. But most of what that's amounted to is rushing in and saying, OK, we can live with a climate or a carbon tax that, also comes with certain strings attached, like lowering taxes in other areas and protecting fossil fuel companies from potentially devastating lawsuits. And part of what I think should be clear is that this will win them no love. Like, this is not going to make the catastrophe say, oh, okay, they're really taking climate seriously, because to take climate seriously is to come up with plans like this. And I haven't seen the reaction yet, but my guess, judging from what we've seen so far, is that this will be viewed by even Democrats as insufficient. That the AOC wing of the Democratic Party is going to say, like, this is not ambitious enough, this is not fast enough, this is not socialist enough. So I don't think you can formulate a position by looking at polls. I think you have to formulate a position by actually having an understanding of what human flourishing requires and how climate and energy fit into that. And I would really like to see a pro-freedom energy policy instead of an appeasing, half-hearted, semi-socialistic response.